PowerPoint number 2, part 2 of the Introduction, Foundations of Evidence-Informed Practice. So how do researchers decide what to study? Well, some of the things that they take into consideration about what kind of interest is there. Who cares about the information, and how might this then advance information that we have in the field? You want to take your expertise into consideration. So what kinds of things do you already know? How can you then use that expertise to explore something that may have been unexplored? We also want to take a look and find out if there are knowledge gaps, meaning what is not known in the research world around a particular topic, population, condition, those types of things. Also, what's the need of society? We want to look at the risks and the benefits. Is it going to be generalizable? How many people are we going to be able to touch with this? And how can we then improve living conditions, so to speak, whether that be a person's personal health or health of the greater society. Who's paying for it? That's a big thing to take into consideration. If you're not going to get any financing around what it is that you want to study, it may be very difficult to actually get something done because research can be very expensive. How is research conducted? Well, first of all, we start out by asking a question. So we're looking at a hypothesis or a premise. Do we want to find out, is this going to be something that's done through basic science or clinical research? We'll answer that question, and I'll tell you more about what that is in a couple slides here. So what kind of data are we looking for? Are we gathering opinions, likes and dislikes, or descriptors, which would fall under the category of qualitative research? Or are we gathering numbers for analysis, which falls under the category of quantitative research? So let's take our researcher's perspective into consideration. When we're doing research, we want to make sure that we are optimizing objectivity, which ultimately comes down to limiting bias. We want to make sure that we're using systematic methods, and that is really about reproducibility and validity, which we will talk about in later weeks. We want to make sure that we are using the appropriate types of statistical analysis. And statistical analysis isn't just about the numbers, and we will talk more about that when I talk about qualitative and quantitative research. Ultimately, what it means is what we are looking at, is it measurable? We want to make sure that something has clinical equipoise, and I want you to know this definition for sure. So ultimately, it's really asking the question, is it balanced? Clinical equipoise really is kind of defined as the assumption that there is not one best intervention during the design of a randomized controlled trial. Ultimately, clinical equipoise is going in with a really open mind about what it is that you're going to find. So more on a research perspective. So again, testing a hypothesis or premise really starts the investigation. We want to make sure that we are following ethical guidelines. There's lots of things to take into consideration. This from everything from how participants are chosen, how they're treated, what population we're looking at, what kinds of conditions are we looking at, and how do we go about making sure that people are protected. We want to look at accurate and objective conclusions, making sure that the design has been thoroughly inspected to make sure that it follows those systematic methods. And we want to make sure that we are using the appropriate design for whatever it is that we are wanting to study. We want to report the results no matter what. This is really truly about honesty and integrity. And then willingness to abandon disproved theories, which ultimately comes down to a feeling and a sense and demonstration of humility. There are two big, broad categories of research. There is basic science or clinical research. These are two things that I want you to get straight because it is part of your weekly graded activity, kind of understanding and knowing the difference between these two types of research. So when basic science, when we're talking about that, it's things that are usually done in a laboratory. We're looking at cells and tissues. It's petri dish stuff, right? It's looking through a microscope. It's really about the small stuff. We're not so concerned in basic research with how a person responds to an intervention. Again, it's really about tissue, it's about chemical reactions, it's about electrical reactions, it's the small stuff. So typically, basic science research focuses on determining the causal mechanisms behind the functioning of the human body in health and illness. And it utilizes hypothesis-driven experimental designs that can be specifically tested and revised. Now, clinical or applied research is usually done in a clinical setting. We're looking at things like procedures and treatments and medications. We're looking at techniques that are being used. We're looking at interventions from a big, broad perspective. We're truly concerned with how a person responds to an intervention, and in clinical research, it's defined as a branch of healthcare science that determines the safety and effectiveness or efficacy of medications or devices or diagnostic products and treatment regimens intended for human use. So again, we're looking at bigger, broader applicability, whereas in basic science, we're really looking at the small stuff. So why basic research? Well, basic research can start that foundational understanding and knowledge to increase knowledge of applied sciences. It's really about basic health improvements, that really foundational piece that gives us an understanding of how tissue will respond. This cuts across multiple sciences. It utilizes biochemistry, microbiology, physiology, and pharmacology. We're looking at clinical issues from a very reductionistic approach, right? We're taking it down to kind of its smallest known common denominator, if you will. It focuses on determining the mechanisms behind how the human body functions, both in health and in the process of disease. We're using empirical methods, which means that we're doing observation, but we're still looking at things from if I put this chemical on this type of tissue, how is that responding? Again, it's really through observation. We're allowing revisions and refinement. It doesn't respond the way that we want to. We can scrap that, or we can try something else. So when the basics are understood, then they can be applied to organs, systems, bodies, and communities. So again, it's a very reductionistic way of looking at things, but ultimately it sets that foundation so that we can then start to build from there, which then brings us to the clinical research. So why do we do clinical research? This is really about development and implementation of interventions. Again, like I said, it's about medications, it's about techniques, it can be about time frames of treatment. So it helps ways to diagnose and prevent disease. So those laboratory tests, those things that are done in basic science, then can help to lead to improvement of those further testing. We're looking at screening procedures in clinical research about early detection. We're looking at quality of life improvements, and we're also looking at things like genetic research that can help tailor made treatments. So we're saving time and money and resources. Again, we're looking at big, broad picture, and I want you to know the definition of epidemiology. It really seeks to identify patterns or causes for certain conditions. So that's really it for week 1. Make sure to do your weekly graded activity, which is on Moodle. You have an online module to do for this week. There are some supplemental videos or readings that are going to help really solidify the information. And then there is a frequently asked questions sheet that is also located on Moodle, which is really going to help you to solidify this information, not only for this class, but for all other classes to come as you study massage therapy at Northwestern.